if you might have noticed that in the emails that announce the class, I put in 2 questions. So what I like to do is preceding every class to give you a little bit of something to think about that's going to frame for a theme that comes in through the class. And so you don't have to do it, but if you want to, I usually begin the class with it, and then hopefully I bring it home at the end with it. The other thing I'm going to try to do is give you chapters to read also, so that if you want to familiarize yourselves with the material before the class, that always makes for a better discussion, but not necessary. Okay, so what we're going to do before we start the class, well, let me just remind everyone what last week's class was about. Last week, we talked about the story of Dinah and Shem, and we talked about the idea that this is the first story of the children of Israel. Until that time, basically, the people that were the actors, the main characters in our story were our forefathers who were prophets. In the story of Dinah and Shem is the first time that we see the children of Israel, our ancestors, acting right with their only guidance being their own internal moral compass. And we saw there we discussed the importance of the Jewish people being a moral compass to the world, but we also talked about how that role is really quite ambiguous. And a lot of times it takes reflection for us to understand that what it is whether or not what we did was actually the right decision. And we also saw that chapter was actually the chapter that the Israeli army goes back to in terms of their own ethics of war. It's called the purity of arms. And I talked about the idea that my son, who's a soldier right now, has countless courses on the purity of arms, literally had its genesis, no pun intended, in that chapter. The other thing that we talked about is we talked about the character of Dinah, and we try to rehabilitate her, because poor Dinah, right? Dinah was the victim, and she lived a life of victimhood. So the Lubavitcher Rebbe thankfully took her out of that place of victim and put her on the pedestal of leadership, and said that she actually represents the first kind of Jewish woman leader, a leader who goes within herself to find her strengths and uses it to effectuate change. And he says that it was really important that Dinah was someone that was outgoing. A lot of times, we think that the ideal Jewish woman is somebody who is quiet and meek, in the home. But what the Lubavitcher Rebbe actually did was he turned that he turned it on its end, and he said, no, if you are blessed with the charisma of someone like Dinah, who was able to actually change the heart of her rapist, and potentially could have changed the heart of an Asab, then you are obligated to go out into the world and try to effectuate change. Okay, so that was last week. This week, we're going to be talking about the story of Tamar and Yehuda. And once again, we're going to see we're going to focus on the power of a strong woman to kind of change the destiny of the Jewish people. But before we do that, let's listen to a song. This song that I'm about to play you has been for the first, when I came to Israel 2 months ago, the first 2 weeks, I was literally in quarantine in my apartment. I couldn't leave at all. So basically what my husband would do each morning is he would play me songs and I would dance to them. Yeah, that's so, and one of the songs, and somehow there were a couple of songs that just became my mantras. And one of them is this song. I want you to think about why it is that I'm playing this song, what the message might be to what we learned last week. And it's really a message that I want to share with you with respect to all the stories that we're going to learn. So I'm going to play you 2 minutes of the song. And I want you to think about, sometimes it's a little hard to get into my mind, the connections, but think about what it is, what connection we can make between this song and the stories of the Bible that we are learning. So here we go. I'm going to share my sounds, and I'm going to share right here the video, and here we go.
אני נוסע ומביט על מה היה ומה נהיה ואיך נפשי עוד הומיע מהמצדה של הזריחות ירושלים בסליחות מחוף כנרת ואכזיב
מהמסיבות של תל אביב אבי חלם והתפלל
לחיות בארץ ישראל היום ילדי אותי שואל מה הסיפור של ישראל
כאן זה בית, כאן זה לב
ואותך אני לא עוזב
אבותינו שורשים
ואנחנו הפרחים המנגינות שבט אחים ואחיות אותה שכונה אותו רחוב תרס ארבנים של יעקב
אוספים ביחד נדודים בתוך תרמיל געגועים אדם ונוף מולדתו חורת קווים בכף ידו בין התפילות לנדרים
ריחות פרדס של הדרים
ובעיניה של אמי
תמיד אמצא את מקומי על הגיטרה מתנגן ניגון עתיק שמחבר
כאן זה בית, כאן זה לב ואותך אני לא עוזב
אבותינו שורשים ואנחנו הפרחים המנגינות שבט אחים ואחיות.
Okay. You can listen to the rest of the song. It's really beautiful and great slides to go with it. Anyone have any ideas why I played that song? If you think about what the chorus was. Ba'anachnu ba'avotenu hashorashim ve'anachnu haprachim. Does anyone know what that means? Right? So the reason why, anyone? Otherwise Alana? Yeah, go Noreen.
Well, the history is like inbred in the people, the history of the people, and it'll always just be a very close part of who we are. And we're the roots, and the flowering of the roots or something, however you translate that. But we're the result of all that history. So it's in our blood and in our hearts. And
awesome, right? Excellent. So, right, their story is our story, right? And the roots, right? The roots of our, we are the flowers of 3,000 generations of roots. And in the same sense, Noreen, right, we are the root of the future, right? So that's, I love, first of all, I love the pictures because also the pictures were a combination of the old and the new, which are all a part of this 71-year-old country that we all call our home. So with that, I want you to go into this story. And I just want you to know, when I teach Tanakh, I mean, there's a very famous phrase that is in the Talmud that explains which stories were included in the canon. And the sages tell us that all the stories that were included in the canon are stories that are relevant to us for every generation. That no matter where you are in history, you open up its pages and there's a message to you. And so when we read these stories, I want us to think about what the message is to us. We'll also reflect on what the message was, throughout our history. So I emailed 2 questions to everybody. The 2 questions that I asked you was, what is the #1 quality that has facilitated the longevity of the Jewish people? Or in Hebrew, what is the single quality that has led to the idea of Netzach Yisrael, the eternal nature of the Jewish people? So that's question #1, okay? Does anyone have any, Geraldine, go.
I would like to say it's the resilience of the Jewish people, but there's another part of it, and that is that wherever the Jews went, they were never assimilated or accepted. And part of that is also why they, through their effort of survival, they have remained because they had to.
So there was there's an insularity and also it's not a survival of the fittest, but they had to find the strength to band together, right? Noreen?
Community.
Excellent. Okay.
Community, yeah.
So which ties into a little bit of Geraldine's point. Any other a single word? Suzanne.
I was actually thinking community, but I was thinking 2 words. Covenant.
Yes. I missed it. Say it again.
Covenant.
That we are a part of a eternal covenant, right? Made way back when, right? That has been passed down. Yes.
Like the Orthodox dating site, I met you at Sinai.
Awesome, right? We met God at Sinai. We took it upon ourselves, right, to remain a singular nation beginning from that period of time. So the covenant and our relationship with God. Any other qualities?
Ariella, tradition.
Yeah. Tradition. Right. That we have handed something down from generation to generation, and we find an importance in that continuity, a ritual. Okay, I'm going to give you one other question. We're going to put that in our back pocket, and we're going to discover 2 qualities, I think, in addition, that facilitated the Netzach Yisrael. What is the #1 quality that will bring about the Messiah?
Humility.
One word.
Humility.
Unity.
Okay. Hey, Cookie, what'd you say?
Achdut, ahava.
Unity and love for one another. Okay, great. Anything else? Shout it out. Yeah, Geraldine?
Well, I'm thinking that it has to be an attachment and a love to our God.
Okay. So, which also might have something to do with the eternal nature of the Jewish people, right? Our love of God. Also, maybe our humility towards that God, right? Understanding that God is above us, right? We are beneath. We answer to a higher authority.
What about returning to Israel?
Wait, Julie, what'd you say?
Returning to Israel, being in Israel.
Excellent. Okay, so the idea now we have the returning to Israel, but I think something really important, the yearning to return. It might be something that facilitates, right, the coming of the Messiah. So let's put that in. Okay. Great. Okay, now let's start to learn. Okay, so remember, we want to try to figure out from this story, the story of Tamar and Judah, right? What is the secret to the to the eternal nature of the Jewish people, Netzach Yisrael, and what qualities need to exist in order to bring about the Messiah. Okay? It's an easy ticket to try to figure out, right? We have an hour and a half to do so. So on your mark, get set. I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to start with the first sources, okay, which is actually from the book of Ruth. And we're going to meet our main character, okay? So if we're going to be doing Ruth probably in 2 or 3 weeks, but we're going to jump into chapter 4 of the book of Ruth, and we meet our heroine, Tamar. Tamar, 10 generations later, and Ruth, as she's about to get engaged, so to speak, to Boaz, the people and the elders of the community bless Ruth with this blessing. They say, may the Lord make the woman that has come into your house like Rachel and like Leah, right? So that makes sense. We're going to bless Ruth with the blessing that she should be like our matriarchs, Rachel and Leah, which truth did build the house of Israel. And let your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. Okay, so this is what's odd. There are 2 things that are odd about this blessing that we're going to begin the class with and end the class with. Why, okay, why is Ruth given the blessing of to be like Tamar? And we're going to learn the story of Tamar begets Perez by pretending to be a harlot in the words of the Bible, and we're telling Ruth, we want you to be like Tamar. The other thing that's odd is that the lineage is attributed to Perez, who is the son of Judah, begotten from this infamous episode in which Judah sleeps with Tamar, thinking that she is a zonah, a whore, right? And so we are saying that instead of telling Ruth that we want her to be like someone coming from the house of Judah, who is the ancestor who symbolizes the Messiah, we are saying, may you be like his son, Perez. Okay, so everyone got our 2 questions. Why Tamar? Who is this Tamar that Ruth should be given a blessing in her name? And 2 is, why is the lineage attributed to Perez as opposed to his father Judah, who we all know is the leader of the Jewish people, right? The ancestor of the Messiah, and blessed by Jacob, his dad, to be just that. So that's our 2 questions. And now we're going to go into chapter 38 of Genesis. Where does this story come? This story comes right in the chapter before. Anyone know what happens in the chapter before? Yeah, Noreen, what happens in the chapter before?
They had just sold Joseph to into the ones that were going to take him to Egypt.
Excellent, right? So we literally have just left Joseph being sold to Egypt by the brothers. Really what has just happened is we leave here we have a beautiful Chagall of Jacob. Jacob finding out that his son has been torn to pieces by some wild animal, and he has the coat to prove it, right? And he can't be comforted. And injected into this story, and then you would think, right, what would be the next story? The next story should be the story of Joseph in Egypt, right? He's been sold, he's Joseph in Potiphar's house, but instead we have this story of Tamar and Judah as a non sequitur, a very strange interlude. So what we want to try to understand is, why is this story placed here? So there are a couple of ideas that are borne out literally by the text. The first one is, we'll start with the first pasuk. It says, "Vayihi ba'et hahi, vayered Yehuda me'et achav, vayet ad ish adulami ushmo Hira." It was at this time that Judah was taken down from his brothers, and he was swayed toward this Ish Adulami. The reason why I wanted to read it in Hebrew is because the text tells us, the Hebrew text wants us to make an association with the previous perek, right? What happened? Who went down in the previous perek, right? Chapter? None other than Joseph, right? So just like Joseph went down to Egypt, something happened to Judah in this perek. What happened to Judah? He was taken down from the stature of leadership of his brothers. Because if you look in the last chapter, right, who was it that actually caused the brothers to sell Joseph? None other than Judah. And so Judah, even at that time, he was a leader. There was Judah was even at that point in chapter 37, he was a leader. The brothers, when they saw Joseph coming, the brothers got all excited. They're like, oh my God, here comes a dreamer, let's kill him. Without really meaning that they should, like when you're hot-headed, when you kind of don't like somebody, you say, well, kill him, right? That's really what they were saying. Reuben took what they were saying literally, and he said, okay, we're going to put him in a pit. And in his mind, he said, I'm going to save him. Judah, on the other hand, calmly and rationally said, I got a plan for this guy, this Joseph guy. I think what we should do is sell him to Egypt. And if you look at the text there, what does it say? Vayishma lo Achav. His brothers listened to him because Judah was a leader who people listened to. And Rashi tells us here that had the brothers came to Judah and they said, if you had told us not to sell Joseph, we would have not sold Joseph. But you didn't. It's your fault. So what did they do? They demoted Judah. And so basically, why is this chapter here? Because this chapter is a consequence of Judah's demotion from the leadership of his brothers, and he's basically kicked out of the family. And he himself feels pretty bad. And the word vayet at Ish Adulami, vayet is like to sway towards. So instead of being swayed toward or sticking with his brothers, he swayed right to the outside world, to this guy, this guy Shira, who we see he's his friend in the story. Okay, so why is this story here? Because this story is a consequence of what happened in chapter 37. On one hand, we could say it's a consequence of Judah's psychological state at this point, that he's really because the brothers no longer are looking at him with respect, he's feeling pretty bad about himself. And so he kind of leaves the fold. And not only does he leave the fold, he's basically kicked out of the fold. We're going to also see that this story is maybe what happens to Judah in the story is also what's called a midah k'neged midah. It's direct retribution for what Judah himself did to Jacob, right? What did Judah do to Jacob? He basically murdered his son in Jacob's eyes, right? And we're going to see what happens to Judah in this chapter. What happens to his two sons, right? They're going to die. Right, so possibly it's very interesting to think about the idea in chapter 37 when the brothers sell Joseph. Right, you would think that God would say, "Tisk, tisk, tisk." That was not a good thing, but we don't hear that. And so, as to actually what's happening in chapter 38 is God potentially saying, "Tisk, tisk, tisk" to Judah. So we have these two ideas of one of a psychological framework in which to look at Judah in this chapter. The other framework is to look at this chapter as a way of God's telling Judah, not so happy with what you did in the last chapter. So now let's get to the story, right? So basically Judah goes down and he gets married, right? He gets married to the daughter of someone named Shiur. Interestingly, we don't know her name. Her name is the daughter of Shiur. It's a little just for those of you who know the story of David and Bathsheba, in Chronicles, Bathsheba is actually called Bathshua. So just like an interesting thing to think about. Anyway, so he marries this daughter of Shua, and they have two sons, Er and Onan. Okay, and they grow up. And what happens? A couple years, they're not very old when they get married. Judah finds a wife for Er, and what is the name of this woman? This woman's name is Tamar. So what's interesting here is, right, Judah's wife has no name, right, but Tamar has a name. And so whenever someone it says her, someone is named very specifically, Shmo or Hushma is something, then we have to look at that name and say, what is in this name? So just as a little aside, there are three women in Tanakh whose names are Tamar. All of them are beautiful, and two of them have really tough stuff happening to them. Okay, there's Tamar, our Tamar, who ends up having to, who dresses up as a harlot and sleeps with Judah, right, and almost gets burned for this action. There's Tamar, who we meet later on who is David's daughter, and is raped by her brother Amnon. And then there is also a Tamar who is one of a granddaughter of David, the daughter of someone named Absalom, who also has kind of an ignominious state in the book of Shmuel. So it's interesting that this also, besides a beautiful name. What is a Tamar? You know, Tamar is a date tree. Okay, so we're going to talk about, is there some significance from the fact that this name of this woman, right, is Tamar, which also is the name of this tree, which is one of the 7 fruits of Israel, right, and is also has a certain symbolism in Jewish thought, which we'll get to. So anyway, so we have this idea. So Judah marries Er off to this woman Tamar. What happens to Tamar, guys? What happens to her? Right? She, not what happens to her, but rather what happens to Er. Er, oops, sorry guys. Decides not to consummate his marriage Er decides not to consummate his marriage with Tamar because she's so beautiful. This was not a good thing in the eyes of God, and he gets killed. And so it's interesting. Remember, in light of the fact that we said that this chapter is potentially a punishment, to the Joseph story. Isn't it interesting that here the brothers in the last chapter have sold their brother right down to Egypt? Nada happens to them, and this guy decides, and Judah's son decides not to sleep in a conventional way with Tamar, and what happens? It's bad in the eyes of God, and he dies. Okay, what happens next then? Are you able to, one second. Okay, let me share the screen again. You know what I think? I'm having a problem with sharing the screen. So can you see the screen, guys? No. Wendy?
Yeah, let me see if anything's changed, probably.
Okay, so I'm going to keep going with the story. So basically what happens next, in the way of the Bible, right? What happens if a brother dies without seed? Then the other brother is supposed to marry, it's called Yibum, right? Is supposed to marry the brother, right? And it's an interesting concept. Basically, what it tells us is that the importance of continuity to the Jewish people, right? That what is the core idea of Jewish marriage is the idea that we were talking about before. Carolyn mentioned this idea of tradition, right? Of carrying forward, right, the Jewish people to a next generation. And it's so important that if someone dies without having a name, right, that is being carried forward, without having that ability, that their brother is supposed to marry the widow and carry forward the name. Let me just see if I can. True. Okay, we're back. So, but what happens? Onan knows that if he marries Tamar, the children aren't going to be his. They're not going to be the first child will not be in his name. So he says also he thinks Tamar is just beautiful, and he doesn't want to mar her beauty with a pregnancy. So I happen to think that people are absolutely beautiful, you know, when they're pregnant, they're glowing. But he says, nope, I don't want to mar her beauty. I'm not going to. I'm not going to consummate my marriage with Tamar. And what happens to him also? Right? That's it. That was evil in the eyes of God, and he also dies. Okay, so now what I want to do for a second is to think about where is Judah now in the story? Okay, Judah is not a very happy camper, right? Judah basically has been kicked out of the brotherhood, right? And not only has he been kicked out of his brotherhood, his 2 children have died. Okay, so poor Judah, right? So Judah, right? It happens that he does have one more son. His name is Shelah, but you can imagine that the last thing that he wants to do is he should be given to Tamar to do this yibum, right? To do levirate marriage, but in his eyes, Tamar is a cursed woman. There's actually a name for that in the Talmud. It's called an isha katlanit. Katlanit means a person who cuts off other people. That there's a concept in the Talmud that someone who is married twice and widowed twice. If anyone watched Dissel, the first love interest of Akiva was an isha katlanit. She was a woman who married, right? She was married twice, and both her husbands died, and that's why Akiva's family did not want Akiva to marry her. And so, in the same sense, Judah was really scared that Shelah would die as well, and he would be left childless. To Judah's credit, another thing that he might have thought is maybe he thought that Shelah was a little young and immature, and that maybe what Shelah would do was exactly what it was that his 2 older brothers did, was not understand the gravity of what it means to be married to somebody and to build a family with that person, that he too would be married only for the purpose of being connected to a beautiful woman. So Shelah, so what happens to poor Tamar? Poor Tamar, Judah tells her, Tamar, you wait, you go back to your father's house and you hang out there. And when Shelah gets a little bit older, I will give it to you and you will get married. And Tamar, obedient Tamar. Tamar also comes from the word, in her name, there are 2 words. One is like Tamimah. She's innocent, she's pure. So in her tmimut, Yaakov, Jacob, who sits in the tent, is someone who is tamim, right? So she goes and she sits obediently in her father's house, but she's also Mara, which is interesting because that's also a name that is attributed to Naomi when she returns to Bethlehem, meaning she's bitter. Right, so she inside of her, right? Here she is married, she is considered still married to Judah's family. She is not allowed to marry anybody else. She is consigned to eternal widowhood until Judah comes and says, okay, now it's time. But the problem is he doesn't, right? So what would you do if you were Tamar? Right? So what you could do is say, goodbye, Judah. I know in your world, I'm supposed to be marrying your son, and there's this whole concept of levirate marriage, but you know what? I want to move on with my life. I'm leaving. Okay, that's number one. She could do that. Number two is she could sit and wait, right? And hope that potentially Judah will come around. Or number three is she can take matters into her own hands, right? What door does she choose? Right, so she waits, and she actually waits for several years. And then she says, wait, like, I need to move on with my life. And not only do I need to move on with my life, but I want to move on with my life in a way that ties me forever to the Jewish people. Okay, I don't understand. Like what I was trying to understand is why like Tamar cared, right? Why did Tamar care? She's not Jewish, right? She's not from the tribe of Israel. Why would she want to connect herself to the Jewish people? So I would say that is check, +1 for Tamar, because Tamar somehow, right, saw something uniquely special about the Jewish people, and she wanted to connect to that specialness. She saw something godly, right, about the Jewish people, and she felt that she wanted to be a part of this grand scheme, as Suzanne said, this grand covenant, right, that is going to be a part of the Jewish people. And so she wanted to figure out a way, right, to get to Judah. One other thing before we get there is the sages actually do, because the sages are kind of trying to figure out why it is that Tamar wanted so much to buy into the Jewish people. So they attribute her, they say that her grandfather potentially was a man named Shem. Anyone know who Shem was, right? Shem was the good brother of Noah's children. He was the descendant of Abraham, and he probably was the one who fiddled into Abraham's ear, right, the idea of monotheism. Possibly also, Tamar was none other than the daughter of Melchizedek, who also was someone who found God. And so maybe what Tamar wanted to do was also to bring Melchizedek, her grandfather and father, right, come full circle, merge them once again with the Abraham family. Okay, so very nice. Who was the other person? Now we're going to go to our sources. Who was the other person that also, even though people said, go home, stay home, we don't want you to be a part, just make life easier for you, right? And yet she pushed herself in. Who was the other person who did that? Yeah, Noreen?
Was Ruth, but you're using very old generations that Tamar was the daughter of. I don't think that sounds a little far-fetched. I think it was much more personal for her. I think she wanted to perpetuate the name of her husband because she knew that's what she was supposed to do. And if she loved him, then that's what she would want to do.
Awesome. No, so excellent. So whatever reason she had, but Noreen, so what we have to say is when the sages attribute someone like to Melchizedek or to Shem, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. It's that they're trying to make a message, right? They're trying to tell us we're also just like we're also questioning why it is that she wanted to stay with Judah. And you're right. So definitely she felt a sense of personal responsibility, which is also a thumbs up to Tamar because she understood like the value of family and perpetuating name, which is not something that was in those days, that was not a thing, right? In those days, you got married, you lived your life in that moment, right? And that was it, right? It wasn't, and when you got married also, you were a chattel, right? You were protected economically. And so we have this idea of Tamar, like thinking beyond like big picture, right? And that is something that's a very Abrahamic, Jewish concept. So anyway, but now let's get into what does she do? Right? What does Tamar do in order to perpetuate? She does something very odd. Right? What does she do? She hears, right? She hears that Judah is in the neighborhood. First of all, you should just know that Judah's wife dies, and Judah was consoled. And you know how he was consoled? I thought it was very interesting. He was consoled. He said what made him feel better is he would go out to the sheep. And when he would go out to the sheep, he felt like a sense of peace. Also, this idea of the recurring theme of sheep also supposed to bring us back to Joseph, right? Because Joseph's coat, right, was dipped in the blood of a goat or a sheep. And also, right, he went to see his brothers who were shepherding. So the text in this chapter keeps on going back to our Joseph images. Anyway, so what does Tamar do? She takes off her widow's garb, right? She covers her head with a veil, covers her face, and she sits at the crossroads. There's a great term for where she was sitting. She was sitting in Petach HaEinayim, in the place of open eyes. And I want to think about the symbolism of that, okay? Like what was Tamar trying to do? Right? She was a person with vision, and she was trying to open up the eyes of Judah and what she was doing. Oddly, also, what is she doing? In a harlot, you would think would be all out there, right? Brave, like everything. But instead, what does she do? She covers her face. And it's interesting, right? That's what she does. And the sages, right? Whether it's true or not, but the sages want to say that she was modest. And she was so modest that even when she lived in Judah's house, she would walk around with her face covered. So that's why he didn't even recognize her, because he had never seen her face. True, not true, but the idea is we want to get into the character of Tamar, that Tamar is doing something that is totally out of character, right? Her brazenness is not something that is of her essence. It's something that is very uncomfortable to her, but she is doing it because she has something, right? She has a plan. And what happens? Does it work? Right? It works. When Judah sees her, right, he thought she was a zonah. I like the word better in Hebrew. He thought she was a harlot, which is also interesting because here we are, right? This is Judah. This is our man, Judah, who is destined to be the leader of the Jewish people. And where is he going, right? He's going to a zonah. Like, this doesn't seem like something that you would want your leader to do. Interestingly, and this is another connection to why this story is here, is what happens in the next chapter? Anyone know what happens in the next chapter? Also kind of along these lines? You could shout it out.
Joseph is seduced by Mrs. Potiphar.
Awesome, right? Does it work? Does she? Nope. Oh. Right? She doesn't seduce him, right? So it's interesting, right? Joseph is not seduced, right? He has a strength to hold back. And there's also parallel imagery, like there's something with a cloak that he leaves behind. And we're going to see what does Judah leave behind a cloak as well. Interesting to think about, right? Joseph, right, is the ancestor of the first king of Israel, Saul, right? Judah is the ancestor of the king of all kings of Israel, David, right? What do we know? Does David succumb to his passions, right? With Bathsheba. So interestingly, right, we have this Judah, right? So something within the kind of the Davidic line or the Judaic line, right, of this being, able to be sworn by passion, okay, to be swayed by passion, okay. So,
and David is also connected through sheep. Actually, when you talked about the sheep, I thought of David as being a shepherd.
Awesome. Right.
That
Shepherd
came
is
to
also
my
a
head.
motif of leadership, right? And also this idea, we also know that David's passion, right, served him well, right? Because that same passion also made him the writer of Psalms, right? Someone who was able to connect deeply to God and to the Jewish people, right? So we have this idea of things being both good and bad, right? Depending on how we use them. But so I just want you to just kind of, it's just interesting to think about, right? You're right. There are motifs that keep on, that go through our stories, right? Through the generations. So let's go to let's finish up this story. So basically what happens, I am now on what page am I? Source 3. So basically he sleeps with her, right? And he doesn't have anything with him. So he says, I'm with a kid, right? There's that goat again. I'm going to send you a goat. And Tamar says, in the meanwhile, though, I need you, as a guarantee, what is, can you leave behind your signet ring, your cloak, and your staff? Okay, very interesting. Like, why not just one? Okay, so the sages also jump all over it because, and they say, what is represented here? Like, these are 3 things that are representative of what's going to come out of this union. The Sanhedrin, which, the judges of the Jewish people, the kingship, and the Messiah, right? So it's no happenstance that these three things are left, right? The deed is done, and what happens? She gets pregnant, right? So meanwhile, she goes back, she puts on, I love the picture on the front because if you look at the first picture, right, here is Tamar, right, like the mass with, the many identities are. And so she goes back to her widowhood, and Judah goes back to his sheep. And once again, he enlists his friends. It's interesting, David and Solomon also have friends. It's always important for leaders to have friends. And so he enlists the same friend, this Hira guy. He says, go find the harlot. I owe her a sheep, right? And they go, they knock on all the doors in Timnah. Lo and behold, there is no harlot to be found. And Judah is mortified, right? Because now, everyone knows, right? He's trying to find some woman, right? And give her a goat, right? What's going on here? So again, the sages, and Rashi picks up over here, he goes the same way that Judah tried to trick, right? To deceive his dad with a goat, right? By dipping Joseph's coat in the blood of a goat. Here too, Judah is deceived by Tamar. So I'm going to just pause for a second and talk a little bit about the name Tamar and why she has that name. So it's interesting that, first of all, this is just a funny, not a funny, but interesting aside. There were 5 women who are attributed to be the ancestors of Jesus. Just okay, and who are they? It is Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and Mary. So just interesting that in Christianity, right, all the mothers of the Messiah all have this kind of like tainted story with them. And so it's interesting because that's a concept that we're going to see being developed, that there is that the Messiah comes from this very interesting union. So what do we know about a Tamar? Okay, what is so special about Tamar, the tree? In Psalms, right? Who is called a Tamar? Anyone know the song? Tzadika Tamar Yifrach, right? So who is considered a righteous person? Sorry, a righteous person, right? Is compared to a Tamar, right? Why? Because a Tamar, every aspect of its being, right, can be used, whether it be for shade, fruit, its bark. Also, it can be used for mitzvot, right, for commandments, like the lulav. So the name Tamar is supposed to make you think of someone who is wholly good and wholly purposeful. There's also something special about the roots of Tamar. They're they're very strong, and they go out very far. And there's a story in the Apocrypha about Abraham and Sarah. Abraham and Sarah, when they went down to Egypt, right? What does Abraham do? He says, Sarah, you're going to be my sister. We're going to pretend we're brother and sister, right? Very odd, right? And it also like, it puts Sarah's life in danger. And it also seems like a little, like it doesn't sit right. And so it's interesting that before the Apocrypha says that the night before Abraham made this decision to Sarah, he had a dream about a palm tree and a cedar tree. And what happened to the palm tree? The palm tree, literally, its roots, right, wove around the cedar tree and gave it support. The palm tree's roots went somewhere that it wasn't supposed to, but by going somewhere that it wasn't supposed to, it strengthened the cedar, right? And so through that dream, he understood, right, that's what he had to do. He had to do something a little uncomfortable in order to make sure that they would survive this challenge, right? So in a sense, what is Tamar doing here also? She's letting her roots, right, go someplace they're not supposed to be, right? They're going to Judah, but what is she doing? She's providing Judah, right, the cedar, with support. So, so there's something in a name. Lastly, I just want to tell you about this tree. The Tamar has very unique properties. This tree is called Metushelach. This tree in 2005, they were doing excavations in Masada, and they found the seeds of a palm tree, and they planted those seeds. And right here in this picture is none other than the product of those seeds from 2,000 years ago. I have to thank Michal Korman for sharing with me this story. How powerful, right? What is Tamar doing here? Right, Tamar right now is thinking much beyond herself. And we see here that a Tamar has this unique properties of giving forth life, right? And sustenance way into the future. So pretty cool, okay? So that was just a little diversion about the name Tamar. And now we have to go to what happens to Tamar. And then we're gonna pause and we'll think about what the story is doing here. So what happens to Tamar? So they find out, it is told that Tamar is pregnant, right? 3 months in, Tamar is pregnant. Interestingly, she doesn't do anything to hide it, right? You would think that she did this, awkward thing, or this thing that is not so comfortable, right? And she is flagrantly pregnant. And it's told to Judah that your daughter-in-law, right, who belongs to your house, is pregnant. And what does Judah say that has to be done to her? Right? She is to be burned. Now, that's pretty harsh. In those days, right? First of all, the whole idea that she belonged to Judah, right, was a unique concept. but that she should be burned? Like where in the law books does it say that? So Noreen, you made, this is what the sages say. The sages say that because she was the daughter of Melchizedek, who was a priest, the rule of the law of a daughter of a priest who whores herself, right, is that she has to be burned at stake because she represents the priesthood in God. Okay. Is that true, right? But there's something, what the sages are trying to do is they're struggling, right? They're trying to figure out why is it that Tamar is deserving of such a harsh punishment, right? Why is she being singled out to be executed for the deed that she did? They say that who were the judges at the time? None other than Jacob, Isaac, and Judah, right? But yet, what we don't see is we also don't see a trial here. Right? Basically, no one asked her what happened, right? And once again, Tamar, what could Tamar do? She has two things that she could do. She could say, save her life, right? And say, Judah, it's your baby, right? But does she do that? No. Right? What does she do? She uses the words, and I have to do it in Hebrew because once again, these are words that harken back to our Joseph story. She says, recognize this, right? Whose scepter, whose scepter, whose string, whose cloak, right, are these? And she's so careful not to embarrass Judah. And that action, right, could lead to her death. But what happens at this moment, right? Judah jumps in and he says, Vayakir, there's that word again, right? He recognizes what has happened and who, right, has gotten Tamar pregnant. And what happens? He yells out and he said, Sak mimeni, she is more righteous than me. Again, a very Davidic quality, right? When David is put on the spot, right? And the prophet Natan says, you, right? You are the one who right? It's you who is guilty, right? David admits his sin. And so we were talking about like qualities that are kingly qualities, right? The idea of humility and responsibility, right? And we're going to see in a second that for these two words and this action, right, Judah is deserving to become the Messiah because he acknowledged his sin, right? And humbled himself before the people and before God. And Tamar, what does Tamar get? Tamar is given accolades because she doesn't embarrass Judah. And from this, we learn the sages tell us the importance of, says it's better to be thrown into a fiery furnace than embarrass somebody. I mean, basically, it says it's better for Tamar to have died than to have embarrassed Judah. Okay, we're going to take a second. We're going to take a pause now before we get to the next part of the story. And I want to know okay, now, so we can think about the idea of Judah, okay? What makes Judah, the progenitor of the Messiah? What do we learn from Tamar, right? What does Tamar have to add to the equation? What Tamar is now, right? Tamar together with Judah, right, are now going to be responsible for the eternal nature, the Netzach Israel, right? And together they are going to be the ones who produce the Messiah, okay? Why Tamar? Geraldine.
Well, my impression of Tamar is that she was very wise in taking care of herself. Had she not gone back and given and more or less not betrayed, but she was deceptive with Judah. Had she not done that, I don't know what her life would have been like. She already has a history. And, it might have been very difficult for her to have gone on in a life. So,
So I'm gonna stop you for a second. So personally for her, right, that's really, I agree. Like she took matters into her hands, right, to make herself a better life. But is that something that is deserving for her to become the mother of the Messiah?
she also was deceptive, and
Yeah,
posed as a harlot.
Right. So that's my question. So is that a quality that I want in the Messiah?
Well, I think in Judaism, we have so many men and women who have villainous qualities to themselves.
Okay,
And
yeah, keep going, Geraldine.
and I think, when they atone, they're always brought up to a higher level because atonement seems to be very, very important.
Yes,
so I don't know. I don't know the story of Tamar, and I don't know what happened to her after, but it would seem to me that she has some atoning to do.
Okay. Does anyone disagree with Geraldine? Does anyone see that she doesn't? Yeah, Julie, go.
Isn't Judah a
Let
little
me play devil's advocate, Geraldine, for a
isn't
second.
Judah isn't Judah a little deceptive for not giving her the son like he promised?
Right. So the question is, who is the, like, as you said, who is the villain in the story, right? We always have to, you are right, 100%, Geraldine, right? This idea of we hold people, and that's one of David's greatest qualities, right? That's why we love David, is because he admits his mistake and he uses that to make himself into a greater person, right? Similarly, we're going to see that with Judah as well, right? So definitely, but I want to say, Lana,
I think also there's a level of accountability here that Tamar is holding Yehuda to. And I think if we're drawing a parallel to Messiah, that we believe that the Messiah is also kind of holding us accountable for our actions, and that, there's the play there.
So a little bit, in order to, if we're giving Judah some great messianic qualities, right? You always need somebody who's going to keep you in your place, right? And make sure that you are staying in the Messiah box, right? Any other ideas? Yeah, Cookie. Go, Cookie.
Well, I think she's also looking to the future, that the line has to continue. So she continued it, but also the deception thing goes all the way back to Yaakov, the ultimate deceptor, the grandfather. So it's all
right. So it's interesting, right? Isn't it interesting that we see these certain qualities? The same thing, Geraldine. You can look at them both ways. Was a deception necessary potentially, right? Sometimes do we do things that are a little bit, for a good end? Does that make the deed bad? Or sometimes is it necessary? I don't know. We're going to get to that in a second. Yeah, go, Cookie.
You were also saying she was at Summit, eyes open, and so maybe she had nevuah that this is what she had to do.
So even if we don't say, right, there's definitely something about she had her eyes open, right, whereas others didn't. Time and time again, don't we find the woman, right, having their eyes open, let's to realities, right, that others don't see, right, and acting acting, right, with that knowledge. So now I want to go to our original question. So what is it? So I think we definitely have this idea. Okay, we've listed some qualities of Judah, right? That we said they're qualities we like in the Mashiach, right? He admits his guilt, right? Which requires humility. He's responsible, right? He takes responsibility. He learns lessons from his past, right? He stands up for what's right, right? He all these things are great messianic qualities. But what does Tamar bring to the table? So what I'm going to argue is it's Tamar who makes him into the Mashiach. And what does she have? Okay, two qualities. And this, I think, is also goes to the idea is what is the secret of the Jewish people? What did we have for 2,000 years? Something that begins with the letter P. P-A-T-I-E-N-C-E. What do we have? What do we have? Right? Incredible, incredible patience, right? Who were we? We were Tamar after the destruction of son number 1 and son number 2, the destruction of temple number 1 and temple number 2. Where did we sit? We sat in our home and we waited and waited for God to bring about the redemption, right? To bring us Shelah. What happens though? Does God do it? Doesn't seem like it, right? Where's that temple falling from the sky, right? Where's the Messiah on the, where's the Messiah on the donkey? Yeah, go, Suzanne.
I thought when you said perseverance.
Excellent. You know what? But I think patience and perseverance, right? They go together because I persevere, and a person who perseveres requires a lot of patience, I think. And I mean, definitely all these are qualities, but I want to pick up on, so you're right. I think that Tamar, right? She shows perseverance and patience, but you know what else she has? And this, I think, is a very, very Jewish quality. And for that, I need a little help from none other than Tevye. Okay, so my favorite movie. Okay, so tell me, let's see. Wait, no, that's not him. We're going to get there in a second. Here we go. Okay, tell me what quality. Wait, I'm going to reshare it because I want to, I don't have the sound, but so 1 second. So, there we go.
He has tradition.
Did you have to send me news like that? Today of all days? I know we are the chosen people. But once in a while, can't you choose someone else?
So what does Tevye have that is a quintessential Jewish quality? Oh, wait, sorry, let me get rid of that. I love this movie. We'll pause it though. What does Tevye have?
Chutzpah.
Thank you. Okay, yes. And do you know what I would say is the quality that Tamar has that brings about the Messiah, and that so many individual leaders that have in recent history brought about the next stage of redemption. You know what they all have? Chutzpah. And I'm not making this up, okay? So there's actually a concept. So I want to go back to my sources for a second and see the rabbis, what the rabbis have to say. So Rabbi Soloveitchik, actually, guys, can you see this? You can see the screen, right? Are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Rabbi Soloveitchik, who lived right in till in the in the 21st century, he says he equates Tamar with the Jewish people, and he says that Tamar was a heroic woman, a great woman. What did Tamar do that others couldn't? She could wait, right? She possesses the heroic ability and patience to wait without ends. Wasn't she the reincarnation of Israel? So what Soloveitchik did was he put Tamar right into the Jewish people of the last 2,000 years, right? The Jewish people of the shtetl, right? But what he didn't do was take Tamar to the next step. Because what did she do? At a certain point, what did Tamar do? She said, I'm not going to wait anymore. I'm going to take matters into my own hands, and I'm going to do something, right, that some might call it villainous, right? Or else I would say she had chutzpah, right? She had what's called azut kedusha. That's what the Rav Nachman Breslev calls it. She had holy chutzpah, holy strength. And I want to, if you look, and what is she, the holy strength, right? To take matters into her own hands. And Cookie, like you said, she stood at Petach Einayim, right? So it's not only the idea of having chutzpah, but you have to live with eyes that are open, right, to knowing when it is time to act. And now, if you look at the people that I have on the bottom of my screen, these are all people that have a tremendous amount of chutzpah and have taken us to the next stage, right, in the redemptive process. Right? They may not have been the Messiah themselves, right? But their chutzpah brought us to the next stage. And I'm just going to tell you the story of a couple of my favorite. So the first guy here, everyone knows. Who is that guy? Just shout it out. Who is that?
Which guy? Which guy?
Right over there. Can you? Herzl, right? Chutzpah. Okay, do you understand what it means that in 1897, right, he said, after 2,000 years, I'm going to gather all the Jewish people together. Never happened in 2,000 years, and we're going to create a conference, and we are going to create a Jewish state, and I'm going to talk, right, a journalist is going to talk to the powers in the world and facilitate the creation of a state, and everyone thought he was crazy, right? He died at the age of 44 out of a heart attack, right? But he had chutzpah, and what did that chutzpah do, right? Led to, right, the formation of the state of Israel in 50 years' time, which he actually prophesies. Next guy, anyone know who that guy is? That's a harder one. Ani medaberet ivrit. Who's that? Would you say?
Ben Yehuda?
Ben Yehuda, excellent, right? Gaul, right? The Jewish people had not spoken Hebrew in 2,000 years. And he said, I am going to make the Hebrew the language of the Jewish people. He literally was imprisoned, right, for doing that. And how did he start? He said, my family is only going to speak in Hebrew. He didn't even let his kids play with other kids. He didn't want them to learn, be tainted by other people, by other children, the language of other children. And he said, if I can get my family to learn Hebrew, right, I can get the nation of Israel to do the same. And he did. And in fact, when I was trying to figure out the derivation of the name Tamar, I went to an organization which he started, which was called the Institute of Hebrew Language, right? So it's like kind of the policeman of the Hebrew language, and gives us the sources of all words. Chutzpah, right? I'm going to do one more because it's my favorite. Maybe two more. Let's see. Who else? Anyone know who this guy is? Yes, Suzanne.
Truman.
Sorry?
Truman, because he voted for the state of Israel, and he supported it.
Who's the other guy in that picture? Anyone know?
His partner.
What? You know who that
His
is?
partner, his Jewish partner.
His Jewish partner.
Yes, Eddie Jacobson, right? Eddie Jacobson. And one of my parents' best friends are the Jacobsons, so I love the name Jacobson. But Eddie Jacobson was Truman's partner in the haberdashery business. Truman in 1948 was sick of hearing from the Jews. He said, I do not want to hear from them anymore. The problem was that at that time, we needed to speak to the President of the United States in order to create the state of Israel. And Chaim Weizmann, who was a very, very sick man, came to America and was waiting to see the President of the United States, and he wouldn't he wouldn't come. Eddie Jacobson, okay, who was not a Zionist, right? B'nai Bris, love it, called him up and said, Eddie, we need you to talk to Truman. And Eddie marched into Truman's office, the Oval Office, and with a few choice words said, you better go see my friend Chaim Weizmann. And Truman listened. And but for that chutzpah, right, I may not be sitting in Modi'in today, okay? Last one, okay, yes, Suzanne?
It should be noted because I actually went to the Truman Library and we did a whole study about that. And one of the things we learned was that he was a counselor, an important counselor to Truman. They were friends, but Bess Truman wouldn't let him in her house. So Truman and Jacobson used to hang out in the garage together.
Love it. And so did Truman, so was it still, is there any element of chutzpah in the idea, or at least in defying Bess? We'll
Absolutely, absolutely. And even if they were partners.
It just like, it makes everything so human, right? Also, it's just, so, okay, last one is really my role model, Natan Sharansky. So Natan Sharansky literally, he brought down the Soviet Union. His chutzpah. There's I'm going to just share with you two great stories. One is, I actually was in Israel when in 1986, I was at the airport to greet him when he got off the plane. It was a very, very powerful moment for me. Very powerful for my sister-in-law. Her daughter is actually named Avital after Natan's wife. And she claims that at that moment, she decided that she was going to make Aliyah because Avital said at that time, who also had chutzpah, Avital said, look what my husband had to do in order to get on this plane, and all you need to do is buy a ticket. And so my sister-in-law decided at that moment to make Aliyah, but that's not the story of chutzpah. Two stories of chutzpah. So Anatoly Sharansky is in prison. He somehow has the menorah, and he's lighting the menorah. And the KGB is not very happy about Natan Sharansky lighting a menorah, so they take the menorah away. What does Natan Sharansky do, which he constantly do? He goes on a hunger strike. Hunger strikes are bad because the world hears that Natan Sharansky is on a hunger strike, and they start bothering the Soviet Union and saying, you better stop doing what you're doing, because Natan Sharansky is on a hunger strike. So Natan Sharansky gets called into the office of the KGB, and they said, Natan or Anatoly, stop what you're doing. So he says, I'll stop what I'm doing if you give me back my menorah. And so the KGB said, we can't give you back the menorah because then you win. So Natan Sharansky says, okay, I'll tell you what, we're going to light the menorah in this office and no one has to know. But the only thing is you have to get me a candle. And when I say the blessing, you need to stand up and keep your head covered. And so what does Natan Sharansky do, right? He lights the menorah in the office of the KGB, with a KGB agent, right? With his hand on his head, right? Standing up while Natan Sharansky says the blessing. Chutzpah? I'd say so. So now, if you want to, let's go back. So what does Tamar add to the equation, right? She adds patience, right, which is the Jewish people, but she also has a vision to know when it is that she has to act with chutzpah. And now, if you remember, there was somebody else, so we can understand a bit, right? Why is Tamar, right, the mother of Messiah? Because basically, right, it's her action, it's her vision, right, that brings about the conditions to allow the Judah, who is the Messiah, to exist and do what he needs to do. But in our original blessing in Ruth, we had another person that appeared, right, strangely. And who is that person? Anyone remember? Who is that person that appeared in the blessing in Ruth? Not Judah, but another P word. Who was attributed? Who was David's descendant? Heroines. Okay, so why? Okay, so now let's try to understand why is it Peretz that is the father of the Davidic dynasty and the Messiah? So let's go back to our story. Okay, so what happens in the story, right? Tamar gives birth. Okay, well, lo and behold, Tamar has twins, right? And both of them, we've seen twins before. These twins are both holy. And what happens? The first guy, right, stretches out his hand. He's about to come out. And so the midwife comes and she ties a string around his hands so that we know that maybe they were identical twins. And so, so we'll know that this is the oldest guy. But what happens? The next son jumps over this guy, right, and comes out first. Who is that? His name is Peretz, right? Who becomes the father of who is attributed to as a father of the Messiah? Peretz, because what does Peretz have? Just like his mother, he's got chutzpah, right? He's like, Zerach is taking his time, patience, you know, one step, right? Till I get out of my mom's womb, right? And Peretz is like, enough of this, right? I want to get out, right? I'm coming out first, okay? So now, really, so why is Peretz, right, attributed again, right, to David? Because Peretz, right, Judah's great, right? Judah's got all the qualities of the Messiah, but what does Peretz do, right? He jumps, right, and makes sure that the Messiah is going to happen. But what's really cool, okay, is the idea that in Tamar's womb are the two aspects of redemption, right? You have Zerach, right, who's patience, right? Patiently waiting, right, to emerge into, be redeemed, right, into this new world. And then there's Peretz, who's so excited, right, that he has to make, right, the future happen, and he jumps out into the world. And in fact, isn't that what redemption is all about, right? We have patience, right, to get to a Herzl, 2,000 years, but then once the redemption begins, we need a lot more patience, right? There's a lot of stuff that's happened, right, since 1897, you know, to 2020. And there's a beautiful Gemara that says exactly that. It brings this all together. And that Gemara is right here. And says that Rav Chia the elder and Rav Shimon ben Chalafta were walking through the Arbel Valley at daybreak. And when they saw the first rays of dawn, Rav Chia the elder said to Rabbi Shimon ben Chalafta, Baribi, like Rebbe, such is Israel's redemption. At first it comes slowly by slowly, and as it progresses, its light increases, right? So slowly, right? We wait for the redemption, piece by piece, right? We bring the redemption about, and then we have these people who jump in, right, with their chutzpah, the Tamars of this world, and what do? Right? They ignite, right, the light of redemption. Then once again, right, what do we have to? Once again, we have patience until we get to the final redemption and the time of Messiah. So now if we want to understand, you know, what this story is all about. So this story is all about, these are the roots, right? And we are its flowers. This is the story of already this is how God works, right? that God always gives us the remedy right before the plague. That even before we have our first slave, right? We're enslaved. What does God do? He plants the seeds of Messiah. With that, that's what I want to end with is two things. Is a beautiful midrash, one of my favorite. Says that the sons of Jacob were engaged in selling Joseph. Joseph was busy with his sackcloth and fasting. Jacob was taken up with his sackcloth and fasting. Reuben was engaged in his sackcloth and fasting. Judah was busy taking a wife. And what was God doing? God, what was he doing? The Holy One, blessed he, was engaged in creating the light of Messiah. And how was he doing it? None other, right? With an odd story, right? But it's a story that really represents the essence of the Jewish people, right? The character of Messiah, the character traits, and the actions, the perseverance, the patience, right? And the chutzpah, the azut kedusha of Tamar, representative of leaders throughout our history, individuals throughout history who live their life with open eyes, able to see the moments when they need to do something, maybe, to some villainous, right? What Herzl did to some, Geraldine, was villainous, right? But he, in his soul, right, in his Jewish soul, knew that what he was doing was he was taking care of the eternal nature of the Jewish people. And so with that, what I just want to do is share with you a light of the Messiah that I see every day. This is a view out of one of my windows. This is the city of Modi'in. And I would have to say that this is a city that is actually built on chutzpah. 20 years ago, well, first of all, 2,000 years ago, this was the territory of the Hasmoneans. They lived here. Where I walk every single day is a place where 2,000 years ago, there was an ancient city of a priest called Anabi. And 20 years ago, and this place was desolate, until 20 years ago, someone had a vision and said, we're going to build a city again on the roots of a place where the city existed 2,000 years ago. And look, if I look out my window, what do I see? Nothing other than the light of redemption. So with that, I wish you guys all a great week. And if anyone has anything that they want to share, I'm going to stay on for a few more minutes. And next week, we are going to do the other side of Esther. So looking forward.